Stella never planned to keep secrets from her family. That wasn't who she was. She was the girl who called her mother every Sunday, who showed up to every holiday dinner with something homemade, who smiled through every uncomfortable conversation and told herself that family meant tolerating things that sometimes felt intolerable. But her parents had a specific idea of success: loud success, titled success, the kind that came with a business card that impressed people at parties. And what Stella had built quietly over 4 years didn't look like anything they recognized, so they decided it wasn't real. The comments started small: a raised eyebrow here, a pointed question there. Then they became dinner table conversations where her career became the punchline, where her mother would sigh and her father would suggest, again, that it wasn't too late to pursue something stable. Stella smiled through all of it. Her husband Marcus did not. He had watched it for 2 years with the patience of a man who understood that his wife was handling something in her own way and on her own timeline. But there is a limit to what a person watches someone they love absorb. And one Sunday evening, Marcus reached that limit, opened his laptop quietly at the dinner table, and turned the screen around. Nobody laughed after that. 4 years of being the punchline. One laptop screen, 30 seconds of silence. Subscribe and ring that bell, because what Marcus shows them on that screen is something nobody at that table was ready for. My name is Stella Rowe. I'm 34 years old and I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I have a career that doesn't fit neatly into the kind of sentence most people use to describe what they do at dinner parties. I'm a creative strategist and content architect. I build brand narratives and audience frameworks for companies that need their story told in a way that actually lands with real people. I have clients. I have contracts. I have a body of work that has taken 4 years of focused, serious effort to build. But when your parents spent 30 years measuring success by titles and office buildings and pension plans, what I do sounds like something you say when you haven't figured out what you actually do yet. My father worked in insurance for 28 years. My mother managed a regional HR department for 2 decades. They built stable, respectable careers with clear ladders and recognizable titles, and they are genuinely proud of that, as they should be. But that framework became the only framework. Success meant a salary with benefits. It meant a title on a business card. It meant something you could describe to a stranger in one sentence without watching their face do the polite confusion thing. What I built didn't translate into that framework. Not because it wasn't real or significant, but because it didn't come with a title they recognized. And for my parents, unrecognizable meant unverified. And unverified meant, quietly but consistently, not quite enough. It was Thanksgiving. 3 years ago, we were midway through dinner when my mother asked how work was going with that particular brightness in her voice that meant she was hoping for a specific kind of answer. I told her things were good: a new client, a project I was excited about. She nodded warmly and then said, almost immediately, "But is it consistent? That's always the worry with that kind of work, isn't it, the consistency?" She said it gently, like genuine concern. My father made a small sound of agreement beside her. Marcus looked at me across the table. I smiled and redirected the conversation toward my cousin's new job, which gave my parents something more recognizable to be enthusiastic about. I absorbed the comment the way I always did. Quietly, completely, and alone. Christmas that same year, my father sat beside me on the couch after dinner with the specific body language of a man who had been waiting for a private moment. He asked about my 5-year plan. I told him honestly: grow the client base, develop a team, expand into a specific market sector I had been researching. He listened with his hands folded and then said carefully that it might be worth considering something more structured while I was still at an age where pivoting was relatively painless. He used the phrase, something with a foundation, like what I had been building for 3 years had no foundation at all. I looked at the Christmas tree across the room and told him I appreciated the thought. He patted my knee like I was 17. Somewhere in year 3, the comparisons became a consistent feature of every family gathering. My cousin Diane got a director title at a logistics company, and my mother mentioned it at 4 consecutive dinners. My cousin Patrick bought a house using his corporate bonus, and my father referenced it whenever the conversation touched anything near finances. I was never attacked directly. It was always adjacent: a comment about Diane's stability, a remark about Patrick's trajectory, delivered warmly and with apparent pride that somehow always managed to illuminate exactly what I, by contrast, supposedly lacked. Marcus started noticing the pattern before I named it out loud. He would find my hand under the table during these conversations and hold it without drawing any attention to the gesture. He noticed everything. Marcus is a quiet man in the way that genuinely perceptive people often are. He doesn't fill space with words when observation serves better. Over those dinners and holiday visits and Sunday calls, I watched him watching my parents, not with hostility, just with the careful attention of someone cataloging something they haven't decided what to do with yet. He never undermined me by jumping in uninvited, never made scenes, never said things afterward that made me feel worse about my own family. But I could see something building behind his eyes at each gathering, a specific kind of patience that has a limit somewhere, a patience that was doing the quiet work of deciding when enough had become enough. I didn't know yet what he would do when he reached that point. I found out on a Sunday in November. The dinner in October was the worst one. My father had made a comment so direct and so public that even my mother had shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't need to repeat exactly what he said. What matters is that I drove home with it sitting on my chest like something physical, and Marcus drove in complete silence beside me, which was its own kind of communication. Around midnight, he found me at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I hadn't touched. He sat down across from me without turning on the overhead light. We sat in the dark for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Stella, I need you to let me do something." I looked at him across the table, and I asked him what he meant. While my parents were forming their opinions about my career was doing something they had no visibility into. The client base I had spent 3 years building carefully and deliberately was beginning to compound in the way that slow, serious work eventually does when you don't abandon it for the approval of people who don't understand it. Referrals were coming in without me chasing them. Contracts were getting larger. The type of companies reaching out had shifted from small startups to established brands with real budgets and real expectations. None of it was loud. None of it announced itself. It just kept growing in the background of every dinner conversation where my parents discussed whether my work would ever amount to anything real. The opportunity arrived on a Tuesday morning in my inbox, a formal project inquiry from a company whose name I had seen in industry publications for years. A brand I respected, a scope of work that was the largest single project I had ever been approached for. I read the email 3 times before responding. Then I spent a week in careful negotiation, signed the contract on a Friday afternoon, and celebrated quietly with Marcus over takeout and a bottle of wine we had been saving for something significant. I told nobody in my family. Not because I was being secretive, but because I had learned that sharing good news with people who had already decided the ceiling of what you were capable of only ever led to responses that made the good news feel smaller than it was. My mother called on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks into that major project. I was at my desk reviewing deliverables, the contract open in one tab, a client communication thread open in another. I answered because I always answered. Within 6 minutes, she had moved from hello to a carefully structured case for why I should consider talking to someone at her former company about an opening in their communications department. A salaried position, benefits, structure. She said the word stability 4 times. I sat at my desk listening with my biggest contract to date open on the screen in front of me, a contract worth more than the annual salary she was describing, and I told her I would think about it. I said it kindly. I meant it as nothing at all. My parents hosted a Sunday brunch in November and invited several of their friends, couples they had known for years, people who had watched me grow up and asked the inevitable questions about life and career with the cheerful intrusiveness of people who mean no harm but cause it anyway. My father, relaxed and social in the way he only got with an audience, made a joke about my career. Framed as self-deprecating family humor, the kind where the humor comes entirely at someone else's expense. The table laughed with the easy laughter of people who don't know they're watching something real happen. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do with 12 people looking at me. Marcus set his orange juice down and looked at my father for a long moment without smiling at all. Marcus waited until we were in the car and 3 blocks from my parents' house before he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He just said clearly and directly that he was done sitting at tables where I was made into a punchline by the people who should be my loudest supporters. He said it without making it about him, framed it entirely around me, around what I deserved, around the specific exhaustion of watching someone you love absorb something that should never have been aimed at them in the first place. I stared out the passenger window while he talked. The Nashville streets moved past gray and quiet. When he finished, I didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then I asked him what he wanted to do. I asked Marcus to wait. I said it clearly and with full intention, not from fear, not from the old habit of keeping the peace, but from something more deliberate than either of those things. I was building toward a specific point. My career was at a stage where the numbers and the recognition were becoming genuinely undeniable, and I wanted the truth to arrive with enough weight that it couldn't be immediately reframed or minimized or absorbed back into the existing narrative my parents had already written about me. I wanted it to land completely. I wanted it to land in a way that left no comfortable exit. Marcus looked at me for a long moment and then nodded. He said, "Okay, but tell me when." I told him I would know when. Marcus opened a new folder on his laptop that same evening. I didn't know exactly what he was doing. He sat at his desk after dinner with quiet focus while I worked across the room on a client deliverable. But I saw him pulling up documents, cross-referencing dates, typing with the specific concentrated energy he brought to things he took seriously. I asked once what he was working on, and he said simply that he was organizing some things. I trusted him completely, so I let it go and returned to my own screen. But I noticed over the following days that the folder on his desktop had grown. He was building something carefully and deliberately. The same way I had built my career. Quietly, seriously, with the full intention of it meaning something real when it was finished. Marcus worked on the folder for 3 weeks. I knew it was happening. I could see the late evenings at his desk, the careful way he'd minimize the screen when I walked past, not secretively, but with the deliberate privacy of someone protecting something unfinished from premature exposure. He asked me small questions occasionally, the exact date of a specific project launch, the name of an industry publication that had featured my work 18 months ago, and the contact information for my business manager. I answered each question without pressing for context. I had told him I trusted him with this, and I meant it completely. Whatever he was building had his full attention, and that alone told me it was going to be something worth waiting for. Marcus called my business manager, Claire, on a Thursday morning while I was in a client meeting. Claire told me about it afterward, said he had introduced himself professionally, explained what he was compiling and why, and asked for her help obtaining official verified documentation of my career earnings across the full 4-year period. She said he was thorough and specific in his requests. He wanted everything verified and formatted cleanly, not approximations, not estimates, but documented figures that carried the weight of professional confirmation. Claire told me she had sent him everything he asked for by the end of day, and that she had also included a summary letter on her official letterhead because, she said, she had the feeling it was going to be used in a room where it needed to look exactly like what it was. What Marcus understood that I had never thought to do was take everything that existed separately and put it in the same place at the same time. The press features were real but scattered, a mention here, a profile there, individual moments that I had experienced and moved past without ever assembling into a single coherent picture of what they represented collectively. The industry recognitions existed in emails and certificates I had filed and largely forgotten. The client testimonials lived in a folder I rarely opened. He found all of it, pulled it together, organized it chronologically, and by category with the clean precision of someone who understood that presentation shapes perception, and that the truth, however clear, still needs to be seen properly to land the way it deserves. Marcus told me afterward that there was a specific moment while he was compiling the revenue documentation when he stopped typing and just sat for a minute. He had pulled together Claire's verified figures and cross-referenced them against the timeline of family dinners where my parents had questioned whether my work would ever become financially viable. The number representing my earnings across the previous 2 years was sitting on his screen. It was a real number, a significant number. A number that exceeded both of my parents' annual salaries combined, not by a small margin, but by a margin that made the dinner table conversations about my financial stability something closer to absurd than concerning. He said he sat with that for a moment before he kept going. I came into the home office on a Saturday morning to refill my coffee, and Marcus was at his desk with the laptop open and the folder visible on screen. He heard me behind him and turned, and instead of minimizing it, he paused, looked at me for a moment, and then turned the laptop slightly in my direction, not showing me everything, just the outline, the structure of what he had built, sections labeled clearly, the shape of the presentation visible without the full detail being open. I stood in the doorway with my coffee cup and looked at it, the architecture of it, the care and specificity of how he had organized 4 years of my work into something that could be seen completely and all at once. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I sat with it overnight, lay awake for a while with the shape of that outline moving through my mind, not anxiously, more like I was turning something over carefully to make sure I understood what I was deciding. Because showing my parents that presentation wasn't just a correction of the record. It was a fundamental change in how I had been operating within my own family. I had been quietly absorbing for 4 years because I believed eventually they would simply see. That morning in the kitchen, I understood that some people don't simply see. They need to be shown. I found Marcus at the breakfast table and told him I was ready. He looked up from his coffee and nodded once. Then he picked up his phone and called my parents to arrange Sunday dinner. Marcus made the call warm and easy, the natural, relaxed tone of a son-in-law who simply wanted to have his wife's parents over for a Sunday meal. Nothing in his voice suggested anything other than a pleasant evening. My mother accepted immediately and offered to bring dessert. My father said he'd bring a good bottle of wine. I was standing in the kitchen listening to one side of the conversation and marveling at how completely Marcus could hold something significant behind a completely normal surface. When he hung up, he set his phone on the counter and looked at me with quiet, steady eyes. I asked if he was nervous. He said no. He said the work was done and the truth was documented, and all that was left now was letting it be seen. Then he went to set the table. My parents arrived at 6:30 with dessert and wine exactly as promised. My mother walked in looking genuinely pleased, complimenting the table setting, the smell from the kitchen, the way the living room had been arranged since her last visit. My father shook Marcus's hand with the particular warmth he reserved for his son-in-law when he was in a good mood and not performing any agenda. We moved through the early part of the evening easily, appetizers, comfortable conversation, the kind of family time that made me occasionally wonder if I had built the tension in my head into something larger than it actually was. Then I would remember October's brunch, and the memory would correct me immediately. I kept the evening warm and let Marcus set his own pace. We were well into dinner. The main course was nearly finished. The wine my father brought was mostly gone. Everyone relaxed in the particular way that a good meal creates. When my father leaned back in his chair with that familiar, settled expression, he started talking about a colleague whose daughter had recently transitioned from freelance work into a salaried corporate role and how much more secure she seemed now. His eyes moved to me at the end of the story with the casual inevitability of a man who believed he was offering a useful perspective. He said he hoped I was thinking seriously about my long-term financial footing. He used the phrase finding solid ground, the same language he had been using in variations for 4 years. Marcus reached beside his chair for his laptop. It was such a quiet movement. No drama in it, no announcement. Marcus simply reached down beside his chair, lifted his laptop onto the table beside his dinner plate, and opened it with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything he did deliberately. My mother looked at the laptop with mild curiosity, the expression of someone who assumes there's a normal explanation for an unusual thing. My father paused mid-thought and watched Marcus navigate to the presentation with a small frown that hadn't decided yet what it was reacting to. I sat completely still across the table with my hands in my lap. Marcus didn't look at my parents while he navigated. He looked at the screen with focused calm. Then he turned the laptop around to face them both and said simply and quietly, "I'd like to show you something." The first thing they saw was the title page. Clean, professional, my name centered at the top with the 4-year date range underneath it. Below that, one line. A verified summary statement from Claire's official letterhead, confirming the documentation contained within, was accurate and professionally certified. My father's small frown deepened slightly as he read it. My mother leaned forward almost involuntarily, drawn toward the screen before she had consciously decided to engage with it. Marcus clicked to the next slide without rushing. The second page was the revenue chart, 4 years of annual earnings displayed in a clean ascending graph with the verified figures labeled clearly at each data point. The room went quiet in the specific way that happens when something unexpected enters a space and instantly rearranges everything inside it. My father had been mid-sentence when Marcus reached for the laptop. He never finished it. By the time the revenue slide was visible on the screen, whatever thought he had been constructing had dissolved completely. He was leaning forward now, both forearms on the table, eyes moving across the numbers with an expression I had never seen on his face in the context of anything involving my career. It wasn't quite disbelief. It was something more complex than that, the specific expression of someone whose internal model of a situation is being revised in real time against their will. The annual figures were labeled clearly. The trajectory was unmistakable. And the total at the bottom of the slide, 4 years of verified earnings in a single number, sat there on the screen with the patient certainty of something that had always been true. Marcus moved through every section with the same measured calm he had brought to building it. Press features, publications they recognized, headlines that were specific and unambiguous. Industry recognitions, 3 separate awards from organizations with names that carried genuine weight in the professional world. Client roster summary, companies listed by sector, the scale of the brands I had worked with visible in a way that context made undeniable. income trajectory showing year-over-year growth without a single declining period across 4 years. He narrated each slide briefly and factually, no editorial, no emotion, no pointed commentary. Just the work documented and presented clearly. My mother had stopped touching her wine glass. My father had not moved from his forward-leaning position since the second slide. The dinner plate sat untouched between all of us. My mother did something I didn't expect. When Marcus reached the final slide, a clean summary page pulling together the key figures and recognitions in a single view, she reached out and touched the screen. Just her fingertips lightly on the revenue figure. Like she needed the physical confirmation that the glass was real and the numbers behind it were not something her eyes were misreading. My father sat back slowly in his chair. Not dramatically. Just the gradual lean of a man releasing something he had been holding in his posture for longer than he realized. The table was completely silent. The candles had burned lower during dinner, and the light in the room had shifted warmer. Marcus closed nothing. He left the final slide visible and set his hands flat on the table and waited. The silence lasted long enough to mean something. Then I spoke. Not with anger. Anger would have made it easier for them to reframe what was happening as an emotional reaction rather than a reckoning. I spoke calmly and specifically. I told them what 4 years of those dinner table comments had actually felt like from where I was sitting. Not the general feeling, the specific moments. The Thanksgiving comment about consistency. The Christmas conversation on the couch. The brunch joke that landed in a room full of people who laughed because they didn't know any better. I named each one clearly and told them exactly what it had cost me to smile through it. The candles flickered once between us. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. When I finished, my father did what I expected. He began framing his behavior as concern, said everything had come from love, said he only ever wanted security for me. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question. I asked him if concern and love were the motivations. Why had not one conversation in 4 years included a single question about what I was actually building? Not one. In 4 years of commentary about my career, my father had never once asked me to explain what I did, how it worked, what I was proud of, or where I was taking it. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. The question sat between us on the table next to the laptop, and he had nowhere to put it that held any weight. My mother had been quiet for most of it. She was a woman who processed inward before she spoke, and I had always known that about her. It was something we shared, actually, which made her silence feel different from my father's. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual managed quality. It came out slightly uneven, not crying, but close enough to it that the difference felt technical. She said she hadn't understood the scale of what I was doing. Said she had let her own framework for what success looked like prevent her from seeing what was actually in front of her. Then she said something that cost her real effort, that she had been unfair, and that the word sorry felt inadequate, but she meant it completely. The table received it in silence. Marcus had been quiet since finishing the presentation. He had let me speak, let my father struggle, let my mother find her way to what she needed to say. Then he closed the laptop gently, not with finality, more like closing something that had done its job completely. He looked at my parents and spoke in the same quiet, direct tone he used when something genuinely mattered to him. He said he hadn't built that presentation to embarrass anyone. He said he built it because he had spent 2 years watching his wife carry the weight of their doubt alongside the work of building something real, and carrying both simultaneously was something no person should have to do alone. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. My mother looked at our hands and pressed her lips together. My parents stayed another hour after everything had settled. The conversation shifted slowly, carefully, like people learning to walk on ground that had recently changed beneath them. My father asked two genuine questions about my work. Real questions, the kind that required him to listen to the answer rather than wait for his turn to redirect. My mother asked to see one of the press features on the laptop before they left and read it fully and quietly while the rest of us cleared the dinner plates. When they finally stood to go, my father hugged me at the door in a way that held slightly longer than usual. My mother touched my face briefly with both hands, a gesture she hadn't made since I was very young. They walked to their car differently than they had walked in. My father called on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. Not my mother, my father, which was notable in itself because phone calls were generally her territory. He asked if I would have lunch with him, just the two of us. He named a restaurant near my office and said he wanted to hear about my work properly, his exact words, properly, like he understood that every previous conversation had been something less than that and was now specifically trying to correct it. We met on a Thursday. He arrived before me and was already seated when I walked in, which told me he had been there early. He had no agenda prepared, no advice ready. He just asked questions and listened with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had decided to finally actually learn something. I got to my desk the next morning earlier than usual. The Nashville sky outside my office window was doing that thing it does in early winter, where the light comes in low and golden and makes everything look like it's been considered carefully. I opened my laptop and pulled up the new project brief I had been excited about all week, a scope of work from a client whose name would have felt out of reach 4 years ago and now simply felt like the natural next thing. I put my headphones in. I opened a new document and started working with a lightness in my chest that I recognized immediately because it was the same feeling I'd had on the very first day I chose this path, before the doubt, before the dinners, before any of it. Just me and the work and all the space in the world to build.